Alrighty. Hello there. We're going to see what we can get going today. Doing my little testing and making sure everything is up and working. And I don't honestly know exactly what we have planned, but we'll come up with something. We just have a little peek at the, yep. OBS and making it show me on the stream when I got a chat thing. By the way, that doesn't need to be top chat unless people get real obstreperous, which doesn't always happen. So hi, I am Chris from Airwindows, launching off this live stream, perhaps before anybody has shown up for it, and pursuing some of my plans for upcoming weeks, because I've been releasing a bunch of plugins and talking about some of the stuff that I'm doing, and then some of the stuff that I'm planning is because people mentioned, hey Patrick, for instance, one person mentioned that they don't see Purest Air in my collections, and I went and looked and I was like, oh, huh. Gee, well, I guess that is because I have not ported it yet. Nice catch. That one got by me. So I've been working on doing that, and it turns out it's a slightly odd plugin, which is not exactly the same as Energy or Air, which I had first. I don't know if it's necessarily better. The idea of something like that is to have it actually be better than the one that was the simpler, pure version of it. And Purest Air is actually a little more complicated and has more going on. But that said, there's no reason I can't put it out anyway. So we'll be having a look at that. And thanks for your well wishes, Patrick. I'm basically well. I have been trying some non-plugin related things that have taken weird turns on me. So that was quite stressful. Some of that was over this last weekend. Hey, David. Oh, other things are other people's fault too? Well, that's reassuring, I suppose. And I've had another bird invasion, but this one wasn't actually even flying in my house to get out. Instead, this morning I had another stupid bird falling down, and the thing ended up stuck in the flue in a place where I could put a garbage bag over it, drop the bottom off of the flue, and have it flapping around madly and insanely in a thin plastic garbage bag. But I was able to close the top of the thing off and carry it outside. And what always concerns me when I do this, because like my problem-solving brain generally, for a variety of reasons, jumps to more complicated things, but also makes up nightmare scenarios that I then have to fix. So what's been going through my mind generally if I'm in a situation like that is, if a bird falls down into my stove, and it is just, Julie, I'll answer that in a moment. Remind me if I don't. That's a good question. If a bird falls down inside my stove flue, and I can put a plastic bag over the bottom of it and drop it out, and then there's a live bird in a plastic bag going completely apeshit crazy, and the bottom of the flue also in this plastic bag, and then I carry it outside, that means that the stove is briefly with no bottom on its flue, so if another bird comes in during the time that I'm releasing the first bird, it drops straight through the flue, down to the bottom, and literally into my room. Where, so that's the worst case scenario, is crouching tiger, hidden bird, jumping up and giving me jump scares. Although I've got to say, this is like the worst thing. I mean, I'm even afraid of moths. So live birds is just all kinds of too much. But being repeatedly and constantly subjected to this means that my fearfulness is kind of going away through it getting beat out of me. I've now had 2 escaping through the front door by letting them out of the actual stove part, which is easier because I don't have to carry it or handle it or get all filthy and sooty and dirty on the stovepipe. And then one from a previous year, where I was able to get it into a bag on the bottom of the stovepipe and carry it outside while it went bonkers and apparently tried to kill me through the bag, which of course is not true. And I've had some interesting thoughts around that as well, which I feel go to a larger, we'll start with large social thoughts today for today's Airwindows session. I tend to think it's always the same bird. If I have repeated issues with the bird getting into my stove, I tend to think that it's going to be, a bird that has decided that it's just going to be a jerk and live in my house. And, well, David, you got to bear in mind, despite you talking about buying something to cap your stove, you should understand that the attention that I'm getting for the plugins is not actually increasing. I'm basically holding at a roughly minimum wage income for all the work that I do and all the work that I've done over the last 10 years and over the last 3 or so years in Patreon. And it isn't really getting worse, and it's sort of increasing a little bit, but there's limits to that. So I may not actually ever be able to fix the stove in that way through earning money to do it. So again, it's just as well that it's slowly starting to frighten me less and panic me less. These are good things. You gotta work with what you've got. So I tend to assume that it's the same bird, because I'm like, oh no, it's back. That bird has decided again, and this is the thing that can cause me, I'll become angry at the bird. I'll think it's all your fault. If only I get rid of this one bird, the problem will be over. And there is something that I'm overlooking if I jump to that conclusion. And this is a common social problem. When you see bad behavior out of anything or anybody, you go oh no, that is the bird. Or you go, all birds are terrible. Or you go, oh, these birds, they don't have anything better than to do but try to invade people's fireplaces. And I'm overlooking the concept that what if this year the population of these dumb little brown sparrows has exploded for some reason. Maybe there's more of them than can really fit in the area. So a reason why some years it's not a problem and then some years it's a big problem. I would have to put a window on the top of the stovepipe, David, because if I put a window on the bottom of the stovepipe, it would just get stuck. So, and I would have to climb on top of my house, and that's not a safe thing for an old codger like me to be doing. If the bird population in the area is extreme and has become excessive, what could be happening is they ain't got nowheres to live. These birds are not singling me out. They don't mean me any harm. They're not doing anything wrong, but as far as all the possible places that birds could build their stupid nests or whatever, and again, this is the crankiness getting into it, because I only see, oh, David's making terrible puns. I only see the part where they're scaring me and getting to my house and seeming to invade and just be trying to mess with me. But what I might not be seeing is a whole bunch of, stupid little birds, frankly. Although I know some people actually like these, small wild birds that are like sparrows and things like that. The ones that are seed eaters are apparently more personable than like larger, burlier ones like robins that are more like hunting for worms and stuff. The ones that are little and just go after seeds and stuff generally can graze all the time. And so they're just less fixated on finding the next worm. But my point being, I could be seeing a situation where the reason they're particularly bad this year, as in multiple getting stuck in my stove and having to come up with multiple ways of dealing with this situation when that does happen, thankfully, which I've done. It's better than in previous years. In previous years, I really didn't have good ways of dealing with it at all. It could just be they are overpopulated this year. There's too many of them. They can't find places to make nests. They wouldn't be trying to invade my space if they had anywhere reasonable to go. So they're essentially getting forced to behave badly with me because there's nowhere else for them to go. I mean, the obvious, somewhat less cute analogy there is like homeless people in California pooping in the street. And people are like, oh my God, that is so horrible. How could they possibly do that? Yeah, if you don't let them into any of your stores, they have no homes, they have no places to go. Conditions are being made in such a way where people will be driven to this pretty antisocial behavior because other people have contrived to make it so that there is no other alternative. I'm not sure if sparrows are carnivores. I think they're insectivores and like seeds or whatever. But with regard to the birds and my potentially having a terrible, gruesome war with the birds and needing to destroy them all, it's easier for me if I remember that I could be looking at a situation where they're not singling me out, and in many ways it's not really their fault. Like if there's too many of them, and I sure do hear and see a bunch of them around, they could just have nowhere else to go. And, again, until I can get the chimney pot thing fixed. And that could happen. I don't think it's going to happen through me saving up money from plug-in posting, unless I continue to do this full tilt and then come up with entirely new other things to also do full tilt. And that's actually something I have put some thought into. But before I get into that, I do want to take a moment to answer Jolie's question earlier, because this could be a tangential, like anytime I, get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, and carry a madly flapping bird in a thin plastic bag outdoors, I'm going to be a little scattered. So it becomes one of those things where it's like a live stream of somebody playing a video game, but really what it's about is listening to them run their mouth on a whole bunch of different concepts and topics. So Jolie's question is like this. Is the effect of interstage something that adds up over many channels as opposed to just putting it on the master bus? With that question, I'm going to say yes. The whole idea of interstage is that it is very subtle and unharmful. It is very chill as far as a behavior is concerned. And you absolutely can stack them, but it's not designed to be something where you have to stack it to make an audible effect, and that's the only way that it's good. The idea is that it could be in multiple places if you want sort of a more analog style feel out of things. And it'll add over many gain stages. For instance, if you wanted to have all of your channels and there otherwise nothing much going on with them, or you're using like Paris Console or something, and you wanted your channels to feel like they were channels on a mixing board and had the small amount of just narrowing inwards a little bit, confining stuff a little bit rather than having it be wide open, every possible sound coming through there. So Interstage is going to restrain and reshape the extreme lows to an extent. It's going to slew clip in a peculiar way which is not quite like any previous plugin I've done. It's not the same as slew or slew 2. It's got something else going on, and I talked about it in the plugin post. First the post, and then the video did finally go up. And what you can do is like throw it on the end or the beginning or the middle or anywhere of channels that you want to be slightly more constrained, and then run stuff into submixes, and you can put them on the submix if you want the submix also to have a kind of containment to itself as well. Because one of the things that happens, a distinguishing factor with large-scale analog consoles, large format analog consoles, is that the individual parts of the console are all going to have restricted behaviors. If they are going from one circuit to another circuit through a coupling capacitor, they're all going to have low frequency cutoff. You can't add a bunch of small offsets and get a big DC output. They're all going to be band limited. If they are all running through analog active circuitry, being transistor, operational amplifier, gain stages, even tubes, they are very likely to be high frequency limited, and not simply by having the part. For instance, some op amps have a very limited slew rate, and you can get an op amp. I've done a little work on this, although I have yet to really experiment with them. I believe I went and got myself 100 op amps of a particular kind. It's used in the EMG 81 pickup for its low voltage, low power consumption factor. But you can get this op amp where you define it, you set a particular biasing resistor on the outside of it, and it makes the op amp have virtually no slew rate capacity at all. Which technically also means you could take this and make it replicate other sort of magical op amps that are famous in guitar circuits and things like that. There's a lot of guitar circuits where part of the sound they have is because there's a slew limit in the op amp, because it's a cheap op amp and can only, pump electricity so fast. And that slew limit restricts peak energy in the high frequencies and completely reshapes the way that it behaves, particularly if you're distorting it. Because if you distort stuff, I've got a pen and I've got paper. I can draw some of these things. If you take something like this and you distort it to this point, then the output you're going to get is just that. Anything beyond that point is not going to count. But if you get something that has a massive slew limit, and then you distort it, what'll happen is your slew limit is going to make another waveform starting from the original point. And since it's a massive slew limit, it's still struggling to reach the point that you're trying to get to. And if you have information like high frequency stuff in the signal, the slew limited version might be letting through some of that information rather than just clipping it off. And this is why there is no biquad in interstage. The biquad version is one that I tried to do and it didn't sound as good, so I didn't have it as an immediate follow-up. Instead, it's something I'm going to experiment with and see what else it's good at. But this is how slew limit or slew clipping in analog hardware changes the sound and makes it be like, this is your magical guitar pedal with the magical op amp that actually was a 10-cent op amp back in the day, but they only made, so many of them, and then people are trying to find these op amps and put them into their tube screamers or whatever. And then other people spend, much like the situation with Dither, other people spend hours trying to debunk it and saying the magical op amps is complete garbage, it's bullshit, it's nonsense. And much like with Dither, or limitations in digital resolution, the people who are debunking it are overlooking really significant things. And part of what's going on in Interstage is another form of slew clipping. It's slowing the reaction to a certain extent. And you can tell that if you take, for instance, a white noise output like I ended up doing in the video. And I'm not sure why David is saying switch to live chat versus top chat. I already have. That's what I'm seeing. I don't know what you're seeing. So that means several things. It means that using Interstage, you're going to get some of this behavior where it's slowing down really artificial, you could say really digital type behaviors. And was it a real question or was it a trolley question? And yeah, it might have been because you spammed too many comments. You would see the question on the stream after the slight latency that it has if it got through. So if you're making too many comments or being too much of a troublemaker and YouTube thinks that you're a troublemaker, then yeah, I'll get to Bo in a moment. I'm kind of scanning what we've got here. Oh, I bet I know what got you, David. If you had a question or a comment and you were talking about like add me as friend and raise money stuff, I bet YouTube censors a bunch of stuff like that because it looks like you're going and trying to do fundraising for yourself. So be cautious about that. And no, I don't mind you being a troublemaker. If you're a troublemaker in a way that annoys me, I'll scold you for it. I will not hide that. Believe me, you'll know if I'm cross with you. So I turned to him. Yeah. And yeah, my stress level is always high. It's part of doing this thing that I do for a living. So I don't intend to break. And I'll try to sort of continue to take care of myself and stuff. And you're quite welcome to keep an eye on me and see if I look as if I'm worse or better in any given week or whatever. But I will do what I can to try to keep going smooth. The Bo is mentioning a 741 op amp. Actually, the one that people consider to be the most magical is not a 741. It's a more obscure one that's one of the Japanese op amps. And I'm not going to be able to remember it now. I could probably look it up. If anybody's really curious, keep asking me and I'll find out. However, Bo has an interesting question. So, how is it that biquads are able to do both high and low pass? Well, the simple answer is I don't exactly know. But the less simple answer is like this. Biquads work like a funny sort of little delay algorithm or something, I'll never get a 1-month vacation, David. Don't even think about it. That'll never happen. I'll get a 1-month vacation when I die. Let's not go there today. These are delay lines. And what happens is it's this algorithm where it's a little bit like a reverb algorithm or an all-pass filter, something like that, where essentially you're making audio go through, you're taking this recording of all the previous samples, like if you were going in this direction, technically, I guess what that would do is you would be kind of going like this. Maybe I've got the direction going wrong, but the idea is like, okay, these are samples going along one after the other, but we're looking at them like a stack, because what we're doing is taking the one that we've got now, and then some of the one that was last time, and some of the one that was the time before that, and we're multiplying them all together. Delay all pass is a special kind of delay line where it's just the one that you had the last time, but you're multiplying it by a very specific number, which is, I think, actually the golden ratio, or at least it's 0.168, and combining it. All pass is the special proportions between the current one and the previous one, and it feeds back. So when you do that with just the single pair of, this one and the last one with an all-pass filter, what you wind up getting is this phase spreading that doesn't actually change amplitude of any given frequencies, but it stretches the phase out of things. I think it's slowest on low frequency sounds, and that's why it's different. When people do complicated phase rotation with all passes, they're using several of them. And you can also do that in hardware, and it does involve a delay factor. Well, the thing with a biquad is you're keeping a stack of all the previous samples, and then you're doing this calculation and getting an output sample, but then you're also keeping a stack of all the output samples. And that's kind of like what a IIR filter is. What an IIR filter is, like, okay, for any given sample, we're keeping something, a number, which is the loudness of the sample. And for any given sample, the output, the value of this number is what it was last plus some of the new information coming in. So if it's what it was last 0.99999 and the new information coming in 0.00001, you got your new info, and the previous information is like a big rock. It's going forward in time too. And then you just have this tiny little amount of the information coming in, and it pulls it in the direction of what your current sample is, just the littlest bit, but then it's keeping most of its original information. And that makes it a IIR filter, infinite impulse response filter, that reacts very slowly. Like high frequencies really just average out. Big low frequencies or a big DC offset, it'll pull this in the direction of where the new information is, and eventually it will reach it. So the biquad works partly like we're just doing I'm trying to think of the type of the convolution reverb of all the previous samples, and we're just using the previous samples and multiplying bits of them to combine stuff. And then also some of this IIR filter-like thing where we're using previous samples to make an output, but then we're saving the output. Because that's what an IIR does, is it uses the previous sample to make this, the thing that reacts more slowly, and then it saves this, and uses it again the next time. So the way that does both high and low pass is that when you have the biquad, the clever thing about it is you have two different kinds of incorporating other samples in the calculation. And some of them are samples that are just used directly and immediately. And some of them are samples that incorporate the output, but then you also have, a delay of one sample on the output and then a whole other one, which is a delay of another sample on the output. And I can't tell you the details of how it's put together, but that gives you enough information where if you do the calculations the way that they say that you should, what you get is a ability to do frequency responses where it's like, okay, this is low pass, so low frequencies to high frequencies, and then it starts rolling off and just keeps rolling off until there's nothing. It is a low pass filter, or a low pass filter that can be sharper and has a boost at the point that you cut it off, that can also be useful. Or the inverse, which is a high pass filter, is just kind of like mimicking that in another way. And again, you can make it so that there's a boost at the point that you're trying to roll off, and that'll make it roll off faster, but also be a little incongruous. It'll be a little bit of a volume spike at that point. And if you want what's called Butterworth, all that Butterworth means is that's the point at which it starts to roll off and there is no spike. You can have shallower than Butterworth. What that means is it rolls off much more slowly. And you can have it roll off so freaking slowly that it acts like it's flat. And the thing that I discovered that was neat, which I haven't put into action in an interstage variant, because I tried it and it didn't sound as good as the one that I was able to do and put out yesterday. You can make it, and I think I've talked about this before, so that your frequency response, you got your bandpass, and what the bandpass means is you only get this frequency and some adjacent ones. It's using both of the roll-offs at the same time, so if you increase the Q, which is the resonance factor, so much that it's just like one frequency, you wind up with this real telephony kind of effect where nothing else is coming through. It's only that one frequency. You can sweep it, sounds like a wah pedal, something like that. But if you have the resonance insanely low, you get this, which is very, very interesting. See how it was designed so that it cuts off. 0 is the end result. When you wind up having it be ridiculously low resonance, and you can do this with the biquad plugin that I put out, you set it to next to nothing, and it starts going closer to like 0 hertz or the Nyquist frequency, but it still ends up projecting literally 0 hertz or literally the Nyquist frequency. It's still a bandpass. You've just widened it so much that it's insanely, the samples it'll let through are insanely wide. But the thing that I found really weird about it, and maybe my metering is just misleading me, I don't know, but it certainly seemed, as compared to the other stuff that I make, that this can make funny kinds of bandpasses, and even ones that slant a little bit. Like if you tell it, do an insanely wide bandpass, but the frequency of this bandpass is actually along the lines of 0.001 hertz, like one cycle every 10 seconds, but it's insanely wide, and you're using long doubles or whatever so it can calculate the insane stuff. You wind up getting this. It still is cutting off DC because, a cycle of 10 seconds is still not DC. And then, since it's so centric around there, it starts rolling off the highs in this very gradual way, and then cutting off once you get to the Nyquist frequency. So, You see, here's the thing. This is a sound sculpting tool, and I felt that it was, when I was comparing it with the Interstage that I put out, which doesn't do all the things that this does. Interstage had more interesting tone color. The Bikewatt stuff was much too vanilla. It was bland. It was bland as anything. It did what it was supposed to do, but there was this boring plastic vanilla quality about it. Not in a sense of like really horrible and bad, but there wasn't anything interesting about it. And so I got to figure out how I would frame that, because making plugins is also partly about, how do you name it? How do you arrange the controls and things? How do you get it so that people know what they can get out of it? And if what you can get out of the Bikewads is mostly just really bland, that's something of a concern. So I have a question that came up. Bo mentions earlier, I haven't seen Boss overdrives that don't have 741s in them. I'm not actually talking about Boss overdrives. I'm talking about Tube Screamers and the like. There's another line of ICs that are typically Tube Screamers. In fact, now that's frustrated me. I'm going to go and look. So to search things, what you do is you look for Tube Screamer Magic Op Amp, which will answer the question typically. And in fact, almost immediately, I found several posts about busting the myth of Magic Op Amps, which these are misguided people who are typically they don't know what slew rate is or how it would matter. So, and I've got a couple of apparently very cheap op amps for sale, and people who are trying to do Tube Screamers. And the magic one is typically JRC 4558, or I think there's a couple of other ones that are even more fancy. People keep talking about the Magic JRC 4558 chip, and the thing is, it's strictly about lacking in slew rate. There's no special ability otherwise, and it will matter, but at the same time, that's not the only way you can do that. You can also have things like the 81 humbucker chip, which is an entirely different chip, but you can design that in such a way that it forces it to have very low slew rate. And the interesting thing about that is I have a device over there, which is the sour filter from Blue Lantern. And that is a resonant bandpass filter for Eurorack that uses the LM4250 chip. And the LM4250 chip is the chip where you can restrict the slew rate artificially to the point where it eats almost no power and responds very slowly. So there's ways of doctoring it to make it an incredibly dirty, grungy sounding op amp. So yeah, I'll get on to the definition of slew rate in a moment. Let me just keep checking to see how we're doing as far as conversation is concerned. Would biquads make for good alias filters? On the whole, nope. And I'll tell you why. The reason biquads have the capacity to do this really steep roll-off like this, the way you have the bandpass, and it's doing extreme rejection down around DC, it's doing extreme rejection at the Nyquist frequency, is because it is a biquad designed bandpass, and the definition of the bandpass as it's being implemented is it kills those two extremes and only lets through the mid-range. So if you widen it, you wind up getting a more linear response in the middle and still nuking the extreme somehow. So the problem with aliasing filters is that what you need to do is make a filter that does a brick wall in the middle here. And a biquad is not going to do that for you. At least to the best of my knowledge. It might be worth doing some more experimenting with things like interleaving. But there is no specific biquad implementation that you can do that with, because if you were to make it that steep, you would also be forcing it to have an insanely steep resonance at that point, rather than just going up to the limit and then brick walling it. Because essentially what's happening with the biquads and measuring it in that way is that you can't actually generate frequencies beyond Nyquist using a bandpass. It's just not going to do it. By the same token, if you're using a bandpass, you're not going to be able to put DC output no matter what you do. It's just automatically going to go, okay, this is a frequency. No matter how much we widen it, we can never quite get to zero. And what you want for a aliasing filter is to be able to take a frequency in the middle of a larger range. Like say you're taking this, you're upsampling it, you're doing some kind of maybe a distortion where you've got your series of harmonics that are being generated by making it nonlinear, and then it reflects off of the end because if you're making nonlinear things happen in a sampling system, it will do that. And then you want to be able to put this brick wall filter in and resample it back to the original frequency and throw away everything that was beyond that, and that'll get you a purer sound. But the biquad can't do that type of brick wall. It's really not designed for it. And I think that is a point in its favor. Brick wall filters are kind of weird, unpleasant designs. I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of brick wall filters in audio. So let me have a peek at some more of this here. Yep. I never sad about getting off track with op amps. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. And honestly, if I am any use to anybody in my sort of minimum wage, grinding it out existence, which granted is doing stuff that I like and care about, so I really can't knock that. I could be doing much worse. But understanding stuff like that is important to me. And when I see people talking about stuff like you don't need any more than 16 bits, etc., then I'd like to call that stuff out. I think the world would be better if there wasn't negative toxic nonsense around. And when it's audio-oriented negative toxic nonsense, sometimes I enjoy doing my own kinds of debunking. Like if a fellow was giving me a hard time on the dither float video, he apparently discovered it somewhere and went, okay, I need to set you straight. You should never dither more than once, and this is nonsense. And I was like, yeah, this guy from Isotope helped me develop it. He demonstrated with measurements and technology that are beyond me and that I don't have, that it was a real thing. Came up with improvements, and then I came up with improvements on the improvements. So as far as I know, Isotope is capable of having floating point dithering now using that guy's own code. He doesn't even have to use my code, and as far as I'm concerned, if he's using his code for it, he doesn't even need to credit me. That's not to say that they do. That's not to say that they do have that going on. But they could with in-house software. So I am not very easy to shame into silence on the back of stuff like that, because it's like, yeah, this caught on with some people who really know what they're doing and are able to demonstrate stuff in practice. So my take with that guy was like, dude, I'm sorry, I'm apparently too much on the cutting edge for you. You're not caught up. Get on my level. And that's always fun. On just a sort of personality level, it's always kind of, you always want to be like, ha, get on my level, peon. You're not as good as me. And that's a very natural sort of animal behavior. It's kind of like posturing. It's kind of like, oh, I'm bigger and stronger than you. Let me scan. I constantly saying, let me scan these questions because I'm trying to keep up. At least I'm talking about audio type stuff. But you're going to have to take this ride with me because I'm not able to construct a coherent narrative while responding to lots of random questions. And the random questions are kind of the important thing, because this isn't just about me making up stuff and lecturing you. It's about me responding. So, Joe asks, is there any relation to analog stuff with the interstage? Yeah, kind of. Interstage is using some old school Airwindows designs to do basically analog-ish things. And the analog-ish things are restricting the bandwidth of things as they keep going through stages of the mix, because restricting the bandwidth is often useful. It's the opposite of what people do in mixes a lot these days. These days, people use stuff to expand the bandwidth wherever possible and make everything be completely full range at all times, which I think is the worst idea ever, and I will always encourage not doing that. But the relation to analog stuff is if you put interstage in places, it will constrict, to some extent, the lows and highs that you wouldn't be getting if you were using a real analog thing. You wouldn't be getting like stored up DC information and super crazy subsonics, and you wouldn't be getting super high frequency things that the active circuitry wasn't able to reproduce. So any stage you put that in, it's going to make it be a little bit more analog-y. I've got a fellow in the YouTube videos who was like, I'm opting out of this one because I don't like analog sounds. And I'm like, okay, that's fair. I never said you had to. I just, I know what I like. So, Patrick asks a smart question, which is, if you run aliased samples through analog gear, is the aliasing still there? Yes, absolutely. If you have digital stuff where you put nonlinearity into it, it generated aliasing, which is the stuff reflecting off of the Nyquist frequency and becoming inharmonic artifacts. You can put it through all the analog gear you want, and the artifacts will still be there. You could maybe dull them by running through really dark analog gear, but the thing is, aliasing exists all through the spectrum. You can have aliasing popping up, and your high-frequency sound is suddenly spitting out 200 hertz. And that 200 hertz is going to be at whatever level it was generated, and it's not going away. So that's one of the reasons that digital sound generates this unpleasantness, is that aliasing cannot be removed once it is generated. The dither float that me and Isotope worked on is in fact the one that I did. If you wanted to use what Alexei from Isotope had, you'd go to I think it's in the mastering forum, the big argument thread about dither. And if you go to that, in there somewhere, in this giant 300-page thread, is me and him talking about stuff. And he started it off by going well, seems a neat idea, but look, I did this test and I measured these tones and things. And some of these tones are being dithered properly and I can see it, and some of them are not. What's up with that? And so we sort of chased after that for a while. And I don't know whether he's using that stuff. It depends upon whether he feels it's necessary or whether the other people at Isotope think that that's a worthwhile thing to run with. He does have literally his own code because I consider that bit to be literally his own code. He came up with like numbers and proportions and things and a new way of organizing it. And I had to come up with a complete clean room implementation to have one that I felt I could MIT license and be absolutely certain that it would be, fully open source with no copyright encumbrances. But by the same token, that means that this fella has stuff that I don't consider to be dependent upon my stuff. Like, he doesn't have to credit me for it. He wrote his own stuff about it. So we may never know. I mean, for maybe Isotope would start doing that and maybe not. I bet they're calculating at a larger word length than the output word length, but that doesn't mean he's using it. What we know is I'm using it because I'm using open source and you can see it being used. Joel asks, do you need more than 16 bits for a final master? Need is a strong word. I think it would be, depends. Like, if you're using a 16-bit final master and you're not specifying sample rate either, 1644.1K is CD quality. And you can, if you work hard at it, you can get it to be pretty damn close. So if you play it back perfectly, you've really got a lot going on. I've taken to buying CDs of music that I like, because if you listen to that with enough diligence, like playing it back in something that is not resampling it or anything like that, doing nothing further to harm it, it's pretty darn acceptable, especially when things, like I said, are dithered properly and handled properly. I would prefer to be using 24-bit and 96K because those are enough of an overkill that you can still dither them, and I approve of handling all these things properly. But that's kind of beyond the point where anybody is likely to be able to seriously object as an output format, as a final master. And that touches on a concept which is, as far as I'm concerned, doing audio work, you never target only exactly what you need. Efficiency does not matter. Audio is so low bandwidth compared to so much else going on that people are doing with bits and passing audio and passing digital information around, that it's insane to be frugal and be like, oh, I don't know, maybe 16 bits are too many, or maybe 24 bits are too many. Shouldn't we be using fewer bits to use only barely as much as you quote unquote need? And I would say regarding, that, though you need more than 16 bits thing, there's a whole series of questions around that. And one of the questions is, does need mean you check it literally every single time? And if you're ever not able to distinguish a thing, that means you blew it. You don't get to care about stuff because you're occasionally wrong. Or what if need was you check stuff a bunch of times and occasionally you're right? Like on a good day, you can hear the difference between a Stradivarius and like a Cremona or whatever it is, some kind of student violin. On a good day, you hear the difference between like a vintage LA2A and somebody's plugin or whatever. On a good day, you hear the difference between like this brand of 12AX7 tube and this other brand of 12AX7 tube that isn't as good in your preamplifier for your fancy vinyl playback setup. And I would suggest that it is possible to call need. At no point are you going to be caught out. At no point is it ever going to be not enough. And that's a completely different bar from testing stuff and being like, well, you weren't able to tell it 16 times out of 16, so you got to let this one go. I'm not of the opinion that the only bar is you can tell the difference and object to the problem 100% of the time, or you don't get to take it seriously. And that's a very significant thing, but that's also a very, I would call it somewhat controversial, but mostly because I'm creating the controversy. The default assumption in both analog audio, even back in the, in the worlds of like high-end home stereo and stuff like that, this has always been the case. And then going to digital and DSP only exacerbates the problem. And what you'll get is people who vehemently want to argue that you must be able to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt any assertion that you might make or anything that you claim to care about. Otherwise, you are invalid and need to shut up about it. And I have no patience for that stuff, so I operate on a different basis. And the basis that I operate on means I have to keep reminding people, hey, some of the stuff that I'm caring about, you're not going to be able to hear every time. I'm aiming for stuff that is really satisfying, because no matter, you have a brief inspired moment with your ears and, oh my God, I feel like I can hear everything, and it doesn't let you down. It's there for you no matter how perceptive you get at any given moment, and then it's gone. And you wind up having a bit of a more of a lame day, and you're not as perceptive as you'd like to be. You've got a cold, you're distracted, you're thinking about something else. That happens to me a lot. That happens to me with these birds. If I was mixing a thing, and all of a sudden there was a bird in my stove, I would not be doing as good mixing. Maybe I'd be making interesting decisions, or maybe it would just, there would be an aggression to the mix that would come in because it'd be all rattled. But as far as perceiving stuff, forget it. I would be way too distracted. I wouldn't be able to perceive as well as I normally would. And brief comment about the dithered. And remember, I make Not Just Another Dither, the one in the Not Just Another Dither that exists in Studio 10 is probably capable of doing a pretty good job of making 8-bit stuff sound pretty well ideal. It's a very high performance dither. But it affects all different kinds of things, like ends of reverb tails are quiet and subtle. If you have linear stuff, like 16-bit CD audio is linear, then the reverb tails will wind up getting grainy. They'll go a little flat. They won't have the spaciousness that you would like. They won't be as far off sounding as you would like. Partly because some of the graininess is higher frequencies coming in. And if you had that same thing with your ultimate high resolution, or 2-inch tape at 30 EPs or whatever, and your reverb tail was on that, then it would fade off into silence, and there would be no high frequency artifacts being generated by the digital quantization. So some things have an easier time of staying smooth, sounding nice, and not generating unwanted additional sounds. Heck, with some of that stuff, you could have a reverb tail recorded to analog tape, and the reverb tail genuinely include somebody dropping a paperclip 500 feet away. It goes tink. And digital would be able to record that just fine, but it might sound like it was exaggerating it. And if you recorded it in analog tape, it would probably smooth it out, and you would be losing the paperclip being dropped 500 feet away. It would be just as inaccurate, but it would probably tend to sound more smooth and fluid and far away. And this is a quality that we call euphonic. If you're doing reverb tails and you want it to sound lovely, smooth, fluid, spacious, and part of your thing there is I don't want high frequency artifacts, you might be using something that exaggerates that quality. So yeah, let's keep scrolling so I don't fall behind. And there's some stuff going on where David's asking about dither float. Nope. The current dither float is my most recent one. Anything that is coming out and honestly, the funny way that is working out is the original dither float, before any of the improvements, was already doing 90% of what you'd care about, and any errors that it has are so far below the threshold of hearing that the people who are criticizing that have a really good point. So I did a full, I knocked my site offline by releasing new updates.zip and having everything be updated with that very first dither float. And that persists, and I've been gradually going through and bringing stuff up to date with all the latest improvements for, the really fussy measurements. And that's all the current stuff since that day. But I've never been able to fire up the literally go and replace everything again, partly because I have to keep coming up with new plugins all the time. So of all the plugins out there, some of them are using that first dither float, which does the important parts of what dither float does. None of them have the isotope code, because that's something that was part of a conversation, and I felt that I just needed to come up with my own way of coding it, and it was actually quite a struggle. That was not easy. And then all of the stuff since that time is the new updated one. So there is still, I know, like, in my copious free time. And of course, I could attempt to take on 10 times the workload, but I also have to take care of my physical health. And so these things are just going to, at some point I might tell people, oh, by the way, hey guys, all of the dither float stuff is now updated for all of new updates. And here you go. Here is a Mediafire link. Please don't kill my site again. Something like that. But, recent stuff coming out is the current, most recent stuff. So, high shelf bits being borrowed from the wood. Okay, I don't know what that means either. Joel's got a question. Can you tell the difference between a 16-bit and a 24-bit on a good day? Well, here's the thing. If you're extremely rigorous about it, it's possible to make 16 bits that if you play them back just right, you wouldn't really find anything to complain about. Saying you could never tell is a leading question. Probably what would happen, because 16-bit is not, like, you could go to 18-bit and make it much more difficult for people. 16-bit is not actually all that much. You have to work hard. And, I wouldn't be trying to do this with normal dither either. I would be needing to use not just another dither to put out 16-bit stuff that I felt was really going to make people struggle to find any fault with it. And what happens when you're telling the difference between something like that, and it's one of those things, is it's this subtle fugitive sense of, something a little flat here. There's something a little uninvolving here. And I don't really feel like that's a person there. Something is slightly missing. And you get this subtle sense of things that you can't really, it's hard to put your finger on, even if you know exactly what to listen for, in terms of thinning and flattening and a lack of dimensionality and perspective. All those high-ender words, all of those high-end audio words. 16-bit tends to erode all of that stuff in, nicely subtle ways. So the thing is, when you ask, is this good enough that you could never tell anyway? My question becomes, how do you mean? Do you mean in the sense of being vaguely dissatisfied of it? Or do you mean in the sense of you're doing a double-blind test 100 times out of 100, you were able to say, this is this one, this is that one, doesn't matter whether, you do specify on a good day. So let's assume on a good day, are you still talking about, we're going to do the test 100 times, they were able to tell that 100 times, so it is absolutely proven that they were able to hear the thing? Because my argument is that is a really high bar. A sense of pervasive dissatisfaction from having stuff that's just subtly off somehow. And you can't really put your finger on it. You can't pin it down. Around half the time, it starts to get to the point where it's could be still bothering you, but you're going to have a hard time proving it or identifying it really easily. And I think this causes listener fatigue, and it causes people not connecting to audio as much. One of the things I intend to do when I do get to that is here's a new thing. Let me see if I can't fire up. I got a file called Airwindows Vinyl Wednesdays. So what I've done is I've taken here, let me point this. Check this out. See that? That is a record rack. And it is a record rack that contains a bunch of vinyl records with it. And I have got a list of everything in there. Apart from I've got some classical stuff in there as well, which I did not list. So I went and I actually used my phone and I entered it into a note, and I've got it copied over to a text file. The text file I've called Airwindows Vinyl Wednesdays. And it contains all of the bands and all of the records in that entire thing. It's not as big as it looks because the bottom thing is only a front row rather than a two-level thing like the top one is. But in total, I have 361 vinyl records there. What I'm proposing to do is start doing a listening session where I'll be playing people that stuff and streaming it, and I'm probably also, I think what I can do is when I get to that 1500 mark and start the Airwindows Vinyl Wednesdays, it may be a 2-hour show. I think I promised 2-hour show. It might be smarter for me to do 1 hour. But the point being, I'll do a YouTube stream in which I am playing excerpts off of my record player and tube preamplifier through the rig and into the stream. I've tested this before. I need to get a way in which I'm being able to hear it on my headphones as well. And also recording a podcast version, because if the YouTube version gets content ID'd, and even though it is going to be gratuitously and obviously fair use for educational purposes, that's the whole point. It's not going to matter. People are still going to copyright strike that stuff. But if I have say a MP3 podcast of the same thing also going out, and yes, that's more work, I know, but they can whack the YouTube stream and knock it off of my channel, and I can withdraw it, hopefully not get banned off of YouTube for shenanigans like that. Because I know people who are doing stuff, like the guy from Wings of Pegasus is basically praising lots of live videos of various people. And they're using copyrighted music on these live performances, but he seems to not be getting in trouble with it, possibly because he's just praising everybody and loves them so much. I'm going to have a lot of that going on, but I'm also going to be putting out a podcast where if the YouTube thing gets whacked, the podcast won't necessarily go away because I'll be hosting it myself. And that's going to be interesting. That'll sort of add up. It's another reason why I can't really do an uncompressed podcast version of it. But it won't be about ripping the actual vinyl and making songs out of it. Instead, it's going to be a matter of experiencing this thing I'm telling you about. This thing about there's this pervasive not there-ness and inadequacy of your 16-bit audio, and there's been so much of that for decades on end. I am over 50 years old. When I grew up, people only had vinyl records when I was starting out anyhow. And the amount of intensity and obsession behind pursuing that stuff and being really into the music was beyond what we see these days. And I'm going to be playing you literally the vinyl records that I had when I was a kid and showing you what it was about that stuff that sounded amazing, interesting, and different. And it will hopefully help make the case for me with that. Boop. I see Andrea LaFosse making a really good point. So I'm going to scroll up just enough to be able to cover some of this. Happy Guy has a concern, and Andre actually answers it. Happy Guy, the thing with wanting the reclaimer to have burden of proof is you don't necessarily have a right to demand that. If you want it, that's fine. You can go and want it all day long. If someone can't hear the difference, I have no obligation to use only what they can barely hear. I can use whatever the heck I want. And that's basically the bottom line. Now, it's hard to hear differences. Yes, it's hard for everybody to hear differences of dithering. There's a reason why when Bob Katz refers to it, he uses an asterisk as if it is a naughty word, because people will get worked up about this stuff. But the bottom line is you're gilding lilies, you're like sweeping up tiny bits of dust. And it's not really about like, oh, how do I listen for the best dither? It's about coming up with something that basically works, and that becomes your process. It's like, and this is one of the reasons why Bob advocates TPDF all the time. You work out something that is the correct answer for the stuff that you're doing, and then you basically do that and don't worry about it. I mean, it's not... Digital audio was designed to operate with dither for the output of word length reduced stuff. That's just how it works. There is no form of digital audio where it's like, okay, well, for this form of digital audio, you quantize without dithering, and that's the correct thing. There's no such thing. Dither is always relevant in a word length reduction quantization scenario. So basically what you do is you work out, like, where am I doing word length reduction? Am I going to 16-bit? If I want to be fussy, am I going to 24-bit? Because that's just sticking to what you know is right, knowing that nobody's ever going to hear the detail of it. But I would always do that, because why would you do a wrong thing just because you feel you can get away with it? And David Pixley hopefully suggesting a bird mic. Yep, I know, right? And yep, there's the thing, is that people are welcome to not care about stuff, but you don't get to tell other people not to care about stuff. You can be fussy if you feel like the people are making you do something you don't believe in, and that's legit. But you don't get to tell people you're not allowed to have this in the world. You're not allowed to care about this in the world because I don't think it's valid. That's not really how that works. So, let's see. Dum-de-dum. Cosmic, I can answer this question right away. You need to figure out if it's worth low passing in between plugins to try to avoid aliasing. No, it's kind of not, because you can't actually avoid aliasing and Nyquist things by doing that. If you really needed to, you could low pass something that you were going to distort, and it would make it less likely for the thing to alias. Like that's kind of what Unbox does, is it throws a distortion algorithm on, but it's doing it in a band limited kind of way. However, it's not worth low passing between plugins to try to avoid aliasing. If you're doing something like Interstage, that's not about trying to avoid aliasing nearly as much as it is having a degree of filtration and slew limiting between places in your mix where they're combining and coming together and making composite sounds. So it's not so much about avoiding aliasing or anything like that. It's a filter. It's a tone coloring to be added. One good way of getting rid of Nyquist issues is to not cause them in the first place. I like capturing stuff to digital audio and then treating it like it is some sort of glorious master tape that you mustn't touch or alter. You don't need to necessarily throw lots of distortion, and compression on things, and you can do amazingly well by just directly capturing stuff to digital and then using it as is. You can use stuff, record tracks into your mix that are maybe not super important tracks, and then rather than processing them into the gray paste I always complain about, take the thing that you just used as this little highlight and play it back on a quiet fader, play it back on some quiet channel, untouched. That's one of the secrets of classic studio behavior. It was one of the secrets of Sound City. I've got a nice video about Sound City, which I always enjoy listening to. And the thing about that is they had this glorious Neve console. And it was such a good console that it automatically sounded amazing no matter what you did. And you could record something and then bring it up in the mix and go, okay, no EQ, no anything. This is just the fader being brought up. Oh my God, it sounds wonderful. Let's use that. And so they did. And in the mix, you can get away with a lot along the same basis if you try. People are not used to trying. People are not used to not using plugins, not using effects on things in this post-80s mix world. But it's really something you can do. I am eager to try. I have also another new thing. If you look over this way, that is a Fender Mustang bass. Yay! I finally got one. And it's actually not being plugged into the system because you're not hearing the system right now. But I have a fader that it's on. And very possibly on Tuesday, I'll be playing that a little bit as well. But things like that, you can come up with ways of bringing into the mix. Recording and digital is fine to just record with. It's like a ideal, totally uncolored tape machine, where it doesn't give you anything that would help you, and it doesn't necessarily take away anything that you need as long as you're recording, sufficiently. If you're recording everything in 16-bit 44.1K, then maybe that'd be a bit of a concern. But yeah. And Cosmic, yes, working at 96K does help. Yeah, happy guy, don't worry about it. I allow people to be critical. And if they get aggressive, then they might be offended as I start to not obey everything that they say. But if you're not being aggressive and if you're not offended, I'm sure we'll get along just fine. And what I'm saying, as far as so you're saying, you can hear the difference between, say, 16-bit and 24-bit. Specifically, if I'm listening to a bunch of, let's say, for example, poorly dithered 16-bit or MP3 stuff, both of which are compromised, or undithered 16-bit, what's going to happen is I'm going to kind of mostly hear everything that's supposed to be there, and there's going to be something dissatisfying about it. I'll describe it as being kind of flat. I'll describe it as being kind of plastic. I've also used the term pot of people for it sounds like there's human beings in a band there, and yet there is something just missing about it. I feel no emotion off of it. I feel no sense of presence anywhere. And I like senses of presence. Some of my favorite things, one thing that I ought to bring back into this room at some point is a Farfisa organ. And I have this nice little Farfisa organ that just does its little signal generators and has a limited number of sounds. But then some of the sounds that I can play on it are these very electric, like pulse waves and things. And you can make these sounds that have extremely sort of pungent personality off of this old Farfisa organ, because although it's the same thing as, like, this is a plugin that is making a pulse wave, um, the intensity and sharpness at the point of the wave, for instance, or the spacing between, wave cycles and the lack of aliasing or jitter in any kind of way, are so intense off of this thing that you get a very organic feeling from it, even though it is a very electric sounding organ. And, you hit a note and there is a physical switch that makes connection, and the switch is carrying, a wire is carrying a ongoing waveform, and you hit the key and another wire comes up and touches it, and there's a little spark when they hit, and that comes through into the waveform. And all of this stuff could be overlooked 9 times out of 10. But I'll find that the Farfisa organ is just sort of more rich and satisfying, pure, pungent. It really conveys the personality. And when I'm listening to the same kind of thing, but it's like undithered 16-bit or whatever, I mean, on and off day, certainly, I'll be like, I don't remember. Oh no, there's a bird in my stove. Okay, now I'm really distracted. I'm not sure if I can tell this every single time. But there's going to be that level of dissatisfaction with something that is blatantly compromised. You can measure this stuff. It is not mysterious. It's not hypothetical. You can measure what is lacking and what is not. Like the Farfisa organ, I don't know how far the harmonics go on that thing. My converter will go up to 192K. I should be measuring it at some point and find out, because some of those sharp-edged waveforms, the harmonics of those go purely way, 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 way up there. Like way, way, way beyond, 20 hertz, 40 hertz, who knows. These electric circuits can do radio frequencies. So you're not necessarily going to get a lot of failing out of that. We keep on. I'm getting a little bit lost. I don't want to fall too far behind. I've got about 40 minutes or so for our talk. Yep. People were talking about dither on reverb tails. I don't think I got around to mentioning the whole dither float thing has nothing to do with reverb tails. It's almost more like having really solid, dense audio and a lot of loud stuff going on, because the thing about floating point is it'll do reverb tails all day long perfectly. It'll just scale down as much as you need, and you could scale it back up and it'll be just fine. So the only concern for quiet things is when you go to fixed point quantizing. Aliasing around minus 80 dB, it's okay. Well, aliasing is never okay, but you can kind of get away with it some of the time. And, from minus 96 to minus 80 dB or so, that's the point where stuff starts to become obnoxious to the I hear it every time degree. Like if you have aliasing around minus 80, that's going to be obnoxious to the point where some people are going to be able to hear it every single time and object to it. And even then, it just becomes part of the sound. Like you can have high frequency roll-offs from analog gear, and they affect or alter the sound just as much. It's just shaping the sound in different ways. When you have aliasing, it shapes the sound in this particular way that's kind of like, old samplers and stuff, where you get this sort of solid, boxy quality to things, and it becomes kind of coarse, but has different sort of textural issues. And aliasing only happens once you've got something going up beyond the Nyquist frequency. So that's mostly going to relate to treble-y and high frequency stuff. EULA again. I'll never be sorry that I made EULA, but it's definitely a bit of a running gag. It works real good for the bit crushers and stuff, I'll say that. Ah, you found a DAW version of a Farfisa organ? Yeah, you ain't heard nothing yet. I need to bring that back. I should put the Farfisa organ back in my place and hook it back up again so that you can hear it. I'll figure out somewhere to put it. There's bound to be a way. But what I liked about the Farfisa organ when I had that going on was it gave me the capacity to bring in on the mix individual waveforms and notes that felt like they were test tones. They felt like they were sort of purer than you should be able to do. And it would be this little square wave, or it would be this little sine wave or something like that, but like beep, unearthly clarity. Just weirdly beyond like Moogs and stuff. There was no shaping to it or whatsoever. It was just this hypothetical ideal of a triangle wave or something like boop. And it would stick out from the texture of the mix so much. And that's what it was. That's what's neat about this old electric organ is its ability to, and part of it is the high frequency extension. Part of it is the fact that it is this very primitive sound generator and capable of making these overtones that cleanly go out just forever. And of course, my streams are being recorded at 96K, and those overtones are going out so far that the sampling is still cutting some of them off, but they're cutting them off very cleanly. And yeah, that's part of what you get with that kind of stuff. Let me keep picking up. Difference of a piano recording. Yeah, any dither differences are going to literally be the quietest possible difference you could ever have. It's never going to be more than that. What happens with these quietest possible differences, and this is also what happens with tone shapers like Studio 10 and, God, what the heck is the other name? Dither Me Timbers. What those are doing to make things sound differently is just quantizing to one direction or the other direction. That's always going to be the subtlest possible difference you can make. The thing is, it's happening like upwards of 44,000 times a second. So it's the tiniest little difference, but there's lots of them, and they add up. So when you reverse polarity in sum, what you're hearing is nothing but the quietness level of the difference that you had. Oh, come to think of it, maybe you're saying something else. If you have a piano recording dithered by the DAW, and by not just another dither, you're reverse polaritying and summing. Probably what's happening there is you have a sample offset, so that they're not lined up as perfectly as they should be. You could use a sample delay to experiment with that. Or your levels are slightly different because you got to reverse polarity and have the amplitudes of those be absolutely and totally perfect. I couldn't exactly tell you, just this null testing stuff is fussy work. It is delicate stuff that way. David is shouting out Reaper. I'm probably going to be changing to Reaper at some point. Not today, but at some point. 24-bit could be measured by phase inverting. You could do that. It's still going to be the quietest possible sound you could imagine. You know, the amplitude is one thing and the pervasiveness of it is another thing. Like if you had something that was a amplitude issue like say the Apogee UV22 thing, which is essentially a kind of bias tone at the Nyquist frequency, and it's not really desirable to there in 2019. People don't really go for that anymore. And if you phase inverted that, what you'd get would be a weird high frequency ringing. And it would still be at the very quiet level, but when you have weird artifacts or high frequency ringings, that can be perceived more easily than just like background noise or other types of issues. So, it also depends on the kind of sound that you've got way, way down so quiet like that. Joku has another interesting observation. I will call attention to this observation because there's something you should know about a company that's currently operating that is gaining my interest, certainly. Old samplers, for what I know, don't suffer from aliasing. Each chip clock is locked to the frequency of the sound. Well, that would depend upon the sampler, and that's not always the case. I don't know that much in the way of samplers that are really doing it that way. You would call that sort of like wavetable synthesis. And basically, old samplers don't do nearly as much of that as you think. They do have aliasing, that's why they have the sound that they have. But, you know who does do that? Noise engineering Eurorack modules. Those ones you sometimes see around, they're very techno-oriented, and they've got weird Latin-sounding names like Bacillus Ateritas Alter, which is a percussion implement that I would quite like to get one of those. I will at some point. Noise engineering Eurorack modules, which are oscillators and things like that, are generating basically a wavetable-oriented thing synthesized by the digital output, but their audio is synchronized to the frequency of the sound. So they're capable of doing high frequencies with literally no aliasing. If there is aliasing, it comes across as harmonic distortion, which is very cool. And they can do really intense... I've seen these modules do things like really sharp pointed triangle waves, and I swear to you, when they're doing that, they're doing some kind of special thing where it's like our reconstruction filter is just drawing a straight line to the next point and then drawing from that point to the next point. And the noise engineering stuff is putting out accurate high frequencies just like the Farfisa organ, of super, super, super bright, accurately placed corners. I suppose I can't say accurately placed with too much conviction because it's possible that that stuff wanders or jitters. But what I've seen on scopes and things like that really illustrates that the noise engineering stuff does not behave like normal sampled audio. It's not operating on the same principle. It instead is like some kind of weird synthesizer that is generating these sharp-edged, essentially analog waveforms being generated through digital techniques. It's the coolest thing ever. So I'm very excited about that. David, you're asking you want to pay $20 for an hour on the phone, but we've got a half an hour. Shoot, I don't care if it's complicated. Just start throwing your question. Otherwise, I might run out of things to talk about. So go ahead. And I don't need $20 from you. So if bit depth is regard to amplitude differences. That's a really interesting... David has brought up a thing and thinks that it would be private and need to pay me for it, but that's not a bad idea at all. I'm going to highlight it. Check this out. Is it fair to say that bit length and width are in regards to frequency and time? Yes, but nobody's going to understand you. Nobody talks about bit width. Bit depth is kind of like the height of... And one thing you've got to remember that samples are not actually a part of audio. Samples are signposts to be used to reconstruct the audio. That's why the noise engineering stuff can do what it does. Like with normal sampling, you're doing stuff where it's being directed by these points, but not necessarily accurately doing them. You could have a situation where your reconstructed waveform goes beyond the sample position, and this is what we call intersample peaking. That's one of the reasons that high frequencies can get you this grungy kind of clipping. Now, the noise engineering stuff, I think, works kind of like this. The noise engineering stuff seems to work like it's got samples, but it's just drawing straight lines between them and then outputting that as an analog voltage. And that is brilliant, and that is not how Nyquist system sampling works. It's not band limited, in other words. In the noise engineering stuff, you could crank up the frequency until it looks like this. And you can have your output look like that. And that is like full-on radio frequency craziness. But their stuff will still produce it. That is not the same thing as what we talk about in sampling in DAWs and computers. So yeah. How will you change those? Cosmic? With this question of how would you do a bright, clear pop vocal, first, the bottom line is kind of similar to that Sound City stuff, where they're like, oh my goodness, this is such an amazing studio, look at the amazing stuff, and what they had was a really good console and really good equipment and good microphones and such, and they recorded stuff cleanly and well. They recorded stuff in good acoustic environments, and they played it back pretty directly. So for a prime, clear, bright pop vocal, mostly what you need to do is have a prime, clear, bright pop singer and a prime, clear, bright pop microphone and anything that is basically a high-quality preamplifier. You got your Neve, you got your API, you've got some things like that. There's kits and things that can also be done. But there's a limited number of stuff, and it's generally very plain and vanilla. Like, I've got an API, it's just got some buttons for phantom power and such, and a single knob, and a single little bar graph. And they're expensive as heck, but they don't have like, oh, tube mojo added sound dial, none of that stuff. So what you want for your prime, clear, bright pop vocal is mostly, above all, record with a great microphone in a great pre, and sample it directly in a great acoustic environment that works super well for you. And then you don't have to fix any mistakes that you didn't make in the first place. That's going to do the best thing for you. As far as Airwindows plugins, if you've already mostly got what you need, you can use something like Energy to add a little extra sparkle to stuff in a useful way. And beyond that, it's pretty much just usual, like what do you need to do? Like if you need to restrict moderate, you could be using something like curve or recurve for compression purposes, because those can be very clean, but they handle stuff well. And yeah, I had a guy sassing my plugin, VaryMu. He was like, this isn't even VaryMu. I'm like, it is variable ratio. I guess we're just not going to agree. Let's see. So if I do a high shelf boost, the data needs to be borrowed from somewhere, mostly the mids. I might have been thinking in mixed terms for that. Like, or, no, I bet I know what I was talking about. If you are mastering to MP3s, is where this relates. Let's say you've got audio. This is your frequency response for your audio. And you're mastering to MP3. So MP3 is taking all of this and sort of dividing it into a bunch of very limited bits of information. And then it's going to reconstruct it and get it kind of wrong because it's only got so much to work on. And that's how MP3 works. So if you're mastering to MP3, you might be like, well, it's being made a little bit more dull. MP3 is losing me some of my information because it feels as if the hi-hats are not quite as good as they were. And part of that is because you need more information to accurately record hi-hats. So it becomes kind of like, here is your more dense information up in the highs, and it's using that because it needs more information to record highs. So you go, well, I don't know, I'm still missing something in the highs. Let's add a massive boost. Now, where has this gone wrong? Here's how it goes wrong. You do the massive boost, and then you require even more data to capture that information. What ends up happening? You're losing information from these other little bits of data that are important. You're stealing them from the body of the music, the mid-range that matters, the bass, all of this kind of stuff, just because you want the highs to act as if it's not an MP3 anymore. And that's a bad idea. So basically, if I said, if you do a high shelf boost, the data needs to be borrowed from somewhere, I was probably talking about making MP3s and stuff, and that's the last thing you want to do. You do not want to go, oh, let's have lots of bright detail on the symbols and things on an MP3. It's a terrible idea. So yeah, ACG, thank you very much. Those who are able to up monthly amounts, I always am very grateful for it because I'm going to be working for everybody whether they can afford to do that or not. And I'm hitting some limits as far as how many people are in the music industry at all and using plugins and things, and how many people are being dragged off to spend their money with like Slate and Plugin Alliance and all that kind of things. And I'll keep doing what I do, but part of what I'm doing is making it possible for people to function even when their money's getting stolen by somebody else. So anybody who is able to do that and help me out, I always appreciate it an enormous amount. Yep. How hard to slam recurve and curve respectively? You're not necessarily going to do that. Things aren't always about slam. Like if you're going to slam, then just use recurve. Curve is about not having to slam it. Curve is about taking the vocal that you've got, throwing that on it, and having it just faintly adjust the dynamic levels into where you'd want them without necessarily having it be exaggerated. Oh, also, pop vocals, I do have a compressor called Pop. And that compressor is designed to give the super insanely hyped, overcompressed thing, like classic old Phil Collins when he was using a Allen and Heath limiter with a microphone input on it. And that was the classic 80s, far too intense Phil Collins vocal sound. If you're looking for that, then you want to try Pop, the plugin Pop. Especially if you're talking about slamming the compressor, that Pop is meant to be slammed. So check that out. Within just Wave, if you have information like this, and you're talking about whether you're going to do a high shelf boost or other boost or whatever, it ain't like that. You don't have a limited number of data points that you can use. Instead, within just Wave, it's literally just, this is the grid you're on. This would be a very coarse quantizing. But within just Wave, within uncompressed audio like that, you could boost, it wouldn't matter. Nothing you do here is going to steal information from here. It's only going to be what you gave it. it'll be, these horizontal lines are going to be kind of like your overall sample rate. The vertical lines, of course, are going to be bit depth, word length. So if you're not using a compressed lossy format, it will not matter. So the digital file has all of these bits there anyhow, whether you use them or not. If you boost something, you're recording this here, and nothing gets borrowed from anywhere else. It's only about mastering from MP3 that you can steal information to put in the highs, and you lose something somewhere else. Within Wave, you don't. It doesn't work like that at all. So that didn't actually take an hour to talk about. However, I'm pleased to say that I was able to solve it. So yeah, I'm glancing again at my Airwindows Final Wednesdays. I'm going to repeat again the what I showed you earlier, that rack of record collection over there. There's 361 records in there, not counting some classical ones that I didn't actually categorize. Would you be interested in me reading off the kinds of stuff? Because the thing about it is I need to make some notes on this. I want to make notes about which ones were evergreens, but we're no longer necessarily talking about I'm only willing to do the ones that were the biggest hits ever. I've got those. I've got a bunch of records where they were the hugest successes ever, and you can hear what initially made those be so compelling to people. And of course, obviously, lyrics, melodies, and all of those are the case. But, lyrics never sold the record. Unless you want to talk maybe like American Pie. But generally, records are music. Records are encapsulated sound. And it's the sound to some of these things that has really impressive qualities that don't necessarily get conveyed easily. And there's another side to this as well. I'm really eager to do this to the point where I'm willing to just do a podcast version of it that will survive even if YouTube is a complete jerk about me doing this. And something else is happening. And some of my sort of highfalutin friends that I talk about sometimes, there's a forum that I hang out on where, it's got the guy that, engineered Cyndi Lauper, the guy that did ZZ Top, Led Zeppelin 3, stuff like that. People like that are still out there. They're still doing stuff. And they recently reacted to information coming out, new information, because you realize that there is a new version of Abbey Road coming out. And you know what version that is? That is a version that is to be remixed by the band's longtime producer, Giles Martin. People were losing their minds in this forum I was telling you about. Because, of course, you realize that's not the name of George Martin. And George Martin wasn't the engineer or the mixer. That owed a lot to Jeff Emmerich, who I think is no longer with us. I have his book. I learned many, many things from this book. No. Giles Martin is George Martin's kid. And because he is George Martin's kid, he got permission to do things like remix stuff and whatever. There's a guy that's doing this type of thing with prog rock. And he's been remixing Jethro Tull and Yes albums and things like that, which interest me very little. I've been getting those because I can get the original flat transfers of the master tapes off of those same compilations, and that works really well for me. I prefer that. I'm not interested in the remixes. Here's the thing. If George Martin's kid remixes Abbey Road to be more like what you would do if you were Britney Spears, all that kind of stuff, you're not going to hear the original mixes anymore. They're going to start marketing and putting out these remixes done like in computers. And again, stuff that can be more Spice Girls, stuff that can be more, Britney Spears or whatever. All the stuff we've learned over the years. And there are huge problems to this, but one of the problems is this. Part of the reasons those sort of war horses of audio are such a big deal is because what happened back in the day actually worked really well. Abbey Road is a masterpiece. It is a fantastic mix. It is a fantastic piece of music. Everything about it hangs together and works. It has bold and audacious decisions like the end to She's So Heavy, where they've got a Moog synthesizer doing a roaring noise sound, and it's getting louder and louder and takes over everything, and then John goes, stop right there. And they just cut the tape. And it was a bold decision, but it works really well. There's not much like it out there. And when you go and let's do a modern remix of these things, let's compress it. Well, that particular move had the impact that it had because the dynamic range of Abbey Road has range, and there's quiet parts and there's loud parts, and that end bit cranks up to an unbearable loudness and then cuts to dead silence. And you compress everything so that it sounds like a television commercial, and you're going to lose all that. So what I want to do with this Evergreens thing, when I get it rolling, I want to make it possible for people to select albums that they would like to see covered out of the 361 that I have in that rack. It doesn't have to be only the ones that were the greatest Evergreen successes of ever, but I do want to have a heavy emphasis on that because I want to show people what was there. You have to know how this stuff was done because it mattered, and it made audio that people engaged with and got really stuck on, and it made it a huge deal, and that's why we're recycling this stuff over and over, is people are sort of doing cargo cult dances around what's sometimes the corpse of a musical experience that at one point was really strong and interesting. So I've got my list. I got my list of Airwindows Vinyl Wednesdays, and I'm probably going to come up with some kind of website where people can select the kinds of stuff that they want. Or some Patreon or Patreon/Discord oriented thing. If I can get people to use Discord to do that, I could probably make it work. I don't know. I'll figure something out. Even though that the time might be approaching, I don't think I'm quite there yet. Cosmic has a real question, so before I'm done, I should cover that. How do you use Edistim and Midside? I think I have a video on that, and that video would probably tell you which one to put first. But what it does is this. What you've got is left and right, and it'll convert it into mid-side, at which point you've got stuff going on that is not handled the same way. You've literally turned the left channel, because it's got to be on stereo. You have to work on stereo. It'll literally turn the left channel into the mid channel, and it'll literally turn the right channel into the side channel. At which point, you can do processing on this, and if it's stuff like compression or distortion or whatever, it will do it in this reprocessed, like if you distort it, mid is going to probably distort first, side is not going to distort so much, and you'll end up with a audio where the center has been smushed a little flatter with distortion, and then the sides are still as loud, and it'll widen things. So my plugin wider does a little bit of that. And then the flip side of it goes back to left is right. So what would happen is you'd have a sound in the middle, and because you're going through the one plugin, that sound is now literally in the middle, and you go through the other plugin, and it goes back. Or you could have a sound that was all to the right, and then it will rearrange it in such a way where some of it's in the middle and some of it's in the side, Whether the side is inverse or not depends upon whether it's right or left. And you can process it that way, and then you go through the other plugin and it puts it back to left or right again. So, Edisdim and midside are used in conjunction with each other. You run through the one and then the other. I think maybe you can even swap positions for them. But the point becomes to do some kind of processing in between, and that becomes mid-side processing no matter what it is. You could do delays, you could do some kind of ping-pong effect, stuff that you could do U-Law, whatever. You could do U-Law and a bit crusher, and then go back out through mid-side or Edisdim. And see, the way mid-side works is like this. I wonder if I have enough space. You got your left and right. Mid is left plus right. What is side? Side is left minus right. So it becomes a lot quieter, and if you've got stuff that's literally in the middle and you do left minus right, you wind up with nothing. Now, if you got something that is all in the right or all in the left, what do you get? Well, mid-range, it's going to be the same as what you had. And then side, it's going to be perhaps the same and perhaps inverted, perhaps flipped. Side is like this. You've got left and right, and they're sort of pushing audio out. Positive, negative, positive, negative. Mid is tie them together. Only both of them can make motion go. Side, you're pointing them against each other rather than just moving sound like left and right would. So side is this sort of intercalculation thing, and instead it's going from side to side. And you translate it back into left and right. And stuff that you did with side can have strange stereo effects as a result of that. Because essentially, if you have just only left or only right, you're going to get stuff in both mid and side as a result of it. Nothing, side is not what you get when you have just the left channel. If you get just the left channel and nothing in the right channel, then mid and side are both going to be just the left channel, because mid is left plus right, side is left minus right. And that's how it works. That's how, on the one hand, they monoize it, combine it into mid, and on the other hand, you take everything that would have been left out from the monoizing. And if you listen to it directly, which you can do using Edisdim, what you're going to hear is some of the stuff that's from one of the side channels, and anything that was in the mids is going away. You've subtracted it. And some of the stuff that's from the side channels is in phase, and some of the stuff that's from the side channels is backwards. It's out of phase. It's flipped, inverted. Because you're not ever meant to listen to side directly. It's about recombining it with mid. And yep. No, it's not an absolute value. Side is definitely not an absolute value. Side is the both polarities value of left minus right. So it can go totally negative, it can be positive, like any waveform going between negative and positive, but it's definitely not the absolute value, because that would mean it would only go positive, and it needs to do both. It's what's left out by just combining the tracks. That's how it mathematically works out. So hey, we covered a lot of ground, I think. I didn't even get to talking about the speakers versus headphone stuff I was going to talk about. I might need to come up with some new thing for helping the poor hapless headphone users who are being told by so many people, including apparently Waves with an Abbey Road thing, and White Sea, who's gone in a direction that I have arguments with. Headphone people are keeping on trying to mix stuff over headphones, and you lose perception of peak energy doing that. And peak energy is a lot of what this classic music that has been so popular over the years has been about. It's where the emotion and overtones of things are carried. It's where the intensity of stuff and the meaningfulness of it is carried. And you don't hear it nearly as easily with headphones on. So what I need to do is take something like subs only or slew only and have it be like peaks mostly. Just come up with something where it's like I'm making a sound and it accentuates peaks over the RMS loudness of stuff. And it couldn't be literally just a anti-compressor or something like that. I've got to do some kind of all-passy blur filter that smooths stuff out in such a way that it'll register more easily, hopefully not be all distorty and stuff. Although if I have to, I totally will. But I gotta come up with something for headphone users that'll show them what they're missing. And I know I'm talking about this wearing headphones. Do as I say, not as I do. And no sound is coming through these. You do understand that. I can't actually hear anything. I'm not listening to audio here. It's just to hold the microphone up. Yeah, and drums are especially hard to mix with headphones because if you have real drums, the dynamic spike of the impact of the drum is really sharp, and you want to be able to manage it and not just flatten it out. But that's exactly the stuff that'll get past you. So it's all very interesting. There is a lot going on, and that's probably a good point. In fact, I'll take an extra moment while I'm here just to literally write that down. Thank you, CG. Drums in peaks mostly. I suppose I could call it peaks only, but that'd be really weird. But yeah, any of that kind of stuff. Peaks are so much of what we like in engaging, interesting sounds. And yeah, I know the headphone comment was a joke. And there is actually nothing coming through these headphones. I find it soothing, actually. I hang around sometimes if I'm writing things. These are earplugs. I wear earplugs willingly some of the time. If I need to focus or if I need not to be rattled by like mad birds and bugs and things going around. So, on that note, I will catch up with you guys next week. This has been a nice stream. Well, I think it's up to other people, I think, more than me, but I do already have a list of stuff that I need to do, so I'll be getting after doing that. I know we've got, what is the name of it? I have a sample trim thing, which is a kind of gate, soft gate, and that's coming out. And I'm also working on Purest Air. I don't foresee any problems with that, so Purest Air should be coming out. Quick answer, because Cosmic had a real question here, and so I should try to answer it. Yeah, put midside in, output split to left becomes M and right becomes S. You'll be able to tell because mid will be louder. You could put effects on S, route back, and then put it in. Yep, that's how that would work. You've got it. And I hope to enjoy the week. Whether I do or not, I'll keep plugging away. I'll keep an eye out for whether I suddenly get to abruptly having to do this Evergreens thing before I have a website or an arrangement. I'm pretty sure I could make stuff up and just pick one to start with. So I might do that if suddenly I'm confronted with, boom, suddenly you're over 1,500. I'll see. I'm not really expecting it by this Wednesday because it was going to be, in the projection of things, it was going to be like a couple of months from now to consistently get to that point. And if it drops back down, I'm not going to I may just do it for like any given moment that we're over 1,500. If I'm over 1,500 on that Wednesday, that's when it'll happen. And if at the end of the month it drops back down again, then you might miss a week. But that'll be fine too. We'll see. Anyways, I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.